For this podcast, we're going to be going to the idea of Jack the Ripper, going back into the idea of covering some of the interesting facts of some serial killers. We're probably going to change a little bit of the factor of how we're going to be doing the channel in the format. As we go forward, I'll be going into that as you'll see on tonight's live stream, because this podcast might go up on the 27th of March of 2019. It might go up then. It might go up on the morning thereafter. It just depends on the time it takes for this stuff to actually kind of be developed. But as with that, we'll be going forward. Start out with kind of asking people to donate to my Patreon page, patreon.com/challengehistory. I'll probably make an actual video on that, asking people to donate on that in the near future. An actual podcast video on that. And we'll have tiers. We have tiers at $1, $10, and $25. If you go up to the $50, once we reach the threshold, which has enough people, there will be a silver Roman Empire coin giveaway that'll initially start out per year with it, but as we start to develop more and more people, it will be more and more frequent. I'm hoping to eventually get enough people on that level that we can actually get that to be something that we can do quarterly at least. And the same thing with the $100 level as well, which will be that is for a Byzantine Empire coin that is actually gold. And those are some things that are kind of cool. Those come from American Precious Metals Exchange, or American Precious Metals Exchange, and that'll be for people who donate on those levels, and that allow them to get something kind of cool. But I'm not just going to give things away for free without the people joining in. And for the other levels with it, I'll figure out what to do for giveaways on that. And obviously for the different levels, you'll be able to suggest in when you get up to the high enough levels, you'll have more of an access to suggested different posts as well, and be able to have your suggestions have priority over what we're normally going to take priority for that. And obviously if you're on, like, let's say like a $50 level would be like the highest level usually that I would put as a priority on that. $100 level is not going to have any more priority than a $50 level, but when it comes to financial level with it, it'll be if there's people of the levels for putting in suggestions, the most money donated gets their suggestions put in first, as long as they're reasonable suggestions. Now, I'm not going to be putting in things in which you're going to be putting in anything of a political bias, or putting in things in which are completely unreasonable topics. Because mind you, we do focus on the idea of being pro-liberty and pro-freedom on the podcast, number one. Number two is we do want to focus on the truth. We're not going to try to put a spin on it for someone wanting a spin. Number three is when it comes down to topics, we're not going to use topics that are going to be biased toward one way or another. So you're not going to be able to spin a topic in your favor. So as long as no off the wall topics that are basically completely goofy, that do not fit to the ideal of something of the ideal of current events, politics, or history. It doesn't really fit into one of those realms, or something social with it. Then we're probably not going to adopt it. Now, if you're just trying to basically put in a bunch of money and troll the channel, your suggestions will be rejected. If you go to the site, you will see the basic idea that it does help me with my for disability, for different costs, and it goes for other things as well, and to put money into the podcast on top of that. And on the 23rd of February, I put in a little bit of an introduction. You can read that to kind of get an idea of that as well. Beyond this is I appreciate every individual donation from $1 a month and up with it. That really helps every little bit. And I will do my best to give you the best effort in every day. Now, there's certain things where I have to kind of like take a little bit of a step back to make sure I'm not overstressing myself out. That's kind of why I'm changing up the format right now, and make sure I don't kind of overstress myself with this, and make sure I can actually do things that I need to do on a daily basis that are necessary for a full and complete life, and make sure that I can have the ability to interact with people, and make sure that I have the ability to do the things that I need to do to make sure that that all aspects of my life are complete. And that's kind of why I'm doing this. And this is just one of those many aspects of my life. And that's what needs to be understood with this. So now going on with this is what we're going to do with this one is we're going to go on to the idea of Jack the Ripper. Now, we're going to go on more of the ideas of the Jack the Ripper case and make it kind of a little bit interesting. Now, it's not that what made him interesting is not the fact that he was a serial killer. Now, most people think him as the first serial killer, which he was not. Or even that he murdered only prostitutes. This was not the case either. It wasn't even the case that he was the first one that had been given nicknames, because we had previous ones in historical context that had nicknames as well. What the reason was there were some points. Number one is we had him taunting the police with letters. Now, this is one of the major things. I will get to that, to the point of the letters, which if we view that as legitimate evidence that that these were actually from the actual killer, that if we can actually prove that this is the actual thing from the killer and not just some person trying to essentially add hysteria on top of that, that what we can do is we can actually add things. We can prove that if this was, that we would have legitimate evidence of who it was that on top of this. And we can actually use some modern points to actually validate that it's not really out of the norm of who this was. And we actually have some legitimate proof to show this. Now, number two is the other thing that was actually what made it kind of interesting is because he did taunt the police. This really made a huge change in the way journalism existed. This made the change from journalism focusing on just reporting the facts to actually becoming more into the idea of sensationalism and trying to essentially do what nowadays in what the digital realm would be as clickbait, and using a lot of terms like that, and that's what they were using back then. And this is what really flipped. And basically is we know throughout his killings is essentially he was known to at least kill 5, which most people actually assumed that because he was such a big name that he must have killed a bunch of them, but he was really more known for just killing a small amount of people. But he was known for actually mutilating the bodies, and that was really more what was another point that was actually quite unique. Traditionally, when we get homicide cases, they traditionally do not mutilate the bodies. That's usually rarely seen, and it's only usually done in cases where we have basically where the person is not at all sane in certain cases, like if we look at Richard Trenton Chase, or if we look at cases like Ed Gein. This is where we'll find some of the cases like that, but we'll also see it in other cases to where they were trying to actually create a scene in which was so grisly that they were trying to freak out the people who found the actual body, and it was meant to actually basically send a signal to the people that found them, either the loved ones or the actual police who actually were looking and seeing the body. And this is essentially meant to send a message. And this this is often the case. And so the idea of the mutilation was in this case not as much of the them being unhinged, but rather them trying to send a message and looking for but in this case, what it was looking for notoriety. Very much in the case of when we look at the BTK killer, which I don't know why I can't remember this offhand, which is Dennis Rader. When we look at Dennis Rader did very much a similar thing with that. While he did not go with mutilating the bodies, he did go with the same idea of taunting the police. Another one that would go with taunting the police was David Berkowitz was another one that ended up taunting the police as well out in New York. And this would be occasionally with it. Now, what they do to avoid getting caught is they end up making the perception of what they're not, and we end up finding this in occasional cases. And if with people stating that what we need to understand is that it's not always the usual case where people say, well, it can't be that type of person because that's not what we would assume as a killer. Well, that's not always the case, because we would seem because it's a lot of times the case of the killer is often could be anything from the area could be the killer, and it could be from any type of job. We saw with the Golden State Killer, in which it was an actual cop. We've seen cases in which we've seen doctors kill. In the case of Herman Mudgett, also known as H.H. Holmes. So we know that we can have doctors, we can have police kill, we can have or even drifters kill in any different cases. I mean, we can have the highest levels of people kill to even the lowest levels, and it doesn't necessarily know any bounds. Now, while we haven't had any psychiatrists kill, like in the case of Hannibal Lecter, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's necessarily something that will never happen. So when people make the accusation that it's never going to happen like that, and you're never going to get disorganized killers from the point of these higher places in society, That's not necessarily true, because you can essentially see people that can actually start having two ways they live among society, the two ways they are actually living. They could actually have their perception in society, but their private life could essentially just be completely derailing, and it could lead to such things as these tactics, which could lead to a disorganized killer. I mean, if you look at some of the aspects of people like Andrei Chikatilo out in the Soviet Union, and what would be under the Soviet Union, what would be Russia and Ukraine in nowadays area, you would see that that he would have actually been essentially initially starting out as a college, as basically a professor, either in levels of high school and low levels of college. And he essentially, he ended up dropping out to a supply line manager, but he was still considered as equal to a manager because in that system, which is still something which was necessary. And there's the thing of what they would call tolkach, which essentially is just a manager making sure that products move from point to point. But it still was some level of prestige, and he was still making quite a bit of money, enough for him to provide for not only his family, but also provide for an actual private apartment in another in Rostov. And it allowed him to do all these killings. So it allowed him to actually have this secret life. And he would definitely, in the way he killed, would definitely not have been listed as a organized killer. And so we can actually state that. So if we're going to use those terms with it, you can actually see that people that have actually had some type of prestige would have actually been able to work under that point. And that's why when we start to look at Jack the Ripper, you can't count what you see in the letters. You can't say, well, this word's misspelled, so this definitely means that it must have been a lower person in society. This is why when we start to look at it, we must look at the actual, not as much how the words are spelled, because anybody can misspell, as we should obviously note. It's not necessarily what you how you actually are spelling, because we know that there were actually deliberate misspellings in it, because no person, even as dumb as they were, would spell the word kidney Kidne, and no person out there would have actually spelled the word that way. No person would have actually omitted the Y, even as low of an education as they would have been able to have. To actually be able to have at least some knowledge of operating on the body as they would have had to have, which means they would have had to either have some type of forensic knowledge on the murder cases, number one, or number two, they would have had to have some medical knowledge, which means they would have had to know how to actually spell the actual name of the part that they were removing, which means they could not have been that uneducated, which is why this means that this was actually they were deliberately misspelling words to actually cause people to go off of the track and go after people that were much lower in education than they really were, which is why when they were going after people such as the Eastern European Jews in Whitechapel, that was actually deliberately done. And it would either mean that they would be, and this is something that's very, very important to note as well. That's another important point. Now, as much as the point on what was actually happening, Now, and this another point would be what actually happened because of this case. Now, this case essentially established a lot of changes in how murders were investigated, because they were now investigated in a very, very orderly fashion since this point, in which they weren't beforehand. And what this did is this essentially made it to where they started establishing some early forms of forensics into the in which they were actually and establishing forms of actual homicide units for the for their actual departments in the actual cities. And that's where Scotland Yard was established for that purpose. And that's something that made this very, very unique. Now, this also made the standard for any other larger area for cities as well across the world as well, because this made it a very, very major point that it could hit any other major city, as the poor areas of London, such as Whitechapel, weren't going to be an isolated incident, and other areas around the globe knew this, and so they pretty much copied suit as well. Now, when we're talking about who are we looking at for this, well, this is where we get to another major point, is we have a Spanish handwriting expert, which is actually, in this case, probably the only piece of evidence that if we claim that this was written by the killer, it's the only piece of evidence we can actually go off of. Everything else is speculation, because we don't really have anything else that would be legitimate. And what we have is, if we're going to do that, this would lead to being a legitimate case of where handwriting would be the most legitimate way of noting a suspect. And if you note with handwriting analysis, now handwriting analysis is something in which it's very, very unique, and this is something where we're talking that it's very, very specific. Now, this is where we get Spanish writer Jose Luis Abad, who is basically a handwriting analyst as well as being a writer, and he's basically stated that what we're talking about here is that he brings up the excellent point that when he compares the notes to Frederick Eberlein's writing, is that it actually, he states that he has no doubt that it's the same writer. And even though other experts say the diary is a hoax with it, and some people try to claim it belongs to Liverpool cotton dealer James Maybrick. It's been identified really as he believes that the author is Eberlein, with the actual point there. Now, the reason why it's actually very unpopular is because of the what this would mean is, if you look at the historically with Eberlein, is right after the murders cease with it, you would actually one thing that makes it look very, very suspicious is because Eberlein actually left left the actual thing of being an inspector not much after the Ripper case was considered unsolved, and not much after the Ripper stopped the murders. Now, this would seem that it would look like if we're looking at this case like that it would look like he's a legitimate option for who would be guilty of the murders, because essentially he could have gotten away with it, said, okay, I'm going to resign from my post and retire, and then he could essentially be given kind of a thumbs up from the royal family for his work on the case without the actual problems of actually being discovered as being this killer amongst the actual cops. And this is the actual thing that we need to look at when we're actually looking at some of the interesting points. And a lot of people don't look at this, and where a lot of people have come up with these weird theories is a lot of people try to point it at people in the royal family, which is a very, very rare occasion in history, is when royal members have been killers. This is usually a very, very rare occasion, because beyond I think our most recent one was the Bathory case, and it's usually in very, very rare occasions that we do have leaders like that actually do hands-on killings. So even with relatives thereof with it, it's very, very rare that they actually do killings. Usually, most often is that they order killings, and that's usually what ends up happening. Like if we look into our Marxist leaders, and this is a point that needs to be made, is they're not going to be the ones to say, okay, we're going to go off and kill someone. They're usually not the ones to go hands-on and kill other leaders. And this is what needs to be understood in these situations. And that's why the legitimacy of this idea is actually very, very plausible. Now, where does this idea get its legs? Well, it does get a lot of legs when we start looking at the case of the Golden State Killer, who was also known as the East Side Rapist up in the San Francisco area. There was initially thought to be Rodney Alcala for actually a few years there. They thought that it was Alcala who was the culprit, and it was also the name for the position. Also, the name for the killer was also the original Night Stalker. Now, which was a position that predated Richard Ramirez. But what it turned out was this was actually a long-time police officer. And it defeats this idea that police officers can't be murderers. And it really pokes a hole at that. And we know that police officers can kill just as easily as anybody else. And they can do it and they can get away with it. And this is something that's, if it can happen in the United States, it surely could happen in Great Britain and out in the United Kingdom. And that's something that's could have easily been the case of Frederick Eberling out in England. And it doesn't really it shouldn't be seeming as odd. And that's something that should be considered as not as odd. And I think I'm just going to end it right here, because we've gone over kind of all of the points that have been kind of interesting on the Jack the Ripper case with it, because I don't want to go over individual parts with it, because I think that part has been beaten with a dead horse, and there have been probably countless people who have done it, And if you go over the whole internet, you'll probably find at least a minimum of 100 at least quality different mixture of I would go documentaries to actual analysis on the Jack the Ripper from the actual point of view from a documentary perspective. This is not really to go with the documentary, but more just to kind of highlight some of the interesting points of view. And that's what I'm trying to do here. And kind of bring on some of the more interesting highlights of these cases. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure you share it all around with friends and everywhere publicly. And make sure you check out my Patreon page. If you cannot donate, make sure you share with someone else who can. And that's about it. And I will see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.